Chapter 22 of Under the Lilacs by Louisa May Alcott. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Boy's Bargain. It was some days before the children were tired of talking over Ben's birthday party, for it was a great event in their small world. But gradually, newer pleasures came to occupy their minds, and they began to plan the nutting frolics which always followed the early frosts. While waiting for Jack to open the chestnut burrs, they varied the monotony of school life by a lively scrimmage long known as the woodpile fight. The girls liked to play in the half-empty shed, and the boys, merely for the fun of teasing, declared that they should not, so blocked up the doorway as fast as the girls cleared it. Seeing that the squabble was a merry one, and the exercise better for all than lounging in the sun or reading in school during recess, Teacher did not interfere, and the barrier rose and fell almost as regularly as the tide. It would be difficult to say which side worked the harder, for the boys went before school began to build up their barricade, and the girls stayed after lessons were over to pull down the last one made in afternoon recess. They had their playtime first, and while the boys waited inside, they heard the shouts of the girls, the banging of the wood, and the final crash as the well-packed pile went down. Then, as the lassies came in, rosy, breathless, and triumphant, the lads rushed out to man the breach, and labored gallantly till all was as tight as hard blows could make it. So the battle raged, and bruised knuckles, splinters in fingers, torn clothes, and rubbed shoes were the only wounds received, while a great deal of fun was had out of the maltreated logs, and a lasting peace secured between two of the boys. When the party was safely over, Sam began to fall into his old way of tormenting Ben by calling names, as it cost no exertion to invent trying speeches, and slyly utter them when most likely to annoy. Ben bore it as well as he could, but fortune favored him at last, as it usually does the patient, and he was able to make his own terms with his tormentor. When the girls demolished the woodpile, they performed a jubilee chorus on combs and tin kettles played like tambourines. The boys celebrated their victories with shrill whistles and a drum accompaniment with fists on the shed walls. Billy brought his drum, and this was such an addition that Sam hunted up an old one of his little brother's, in order that he might join the drum corps. He had no sticks, however, and, casting about in his mind for a good substitute for the genuine thing, bethought him of bulrushes. "Those will do first-rate, and there are lots of them in the marsh, if I can only get 'em," he said to himself, and turned off from the road on his way home to get a supply. Now, this marsh was a treacherous spot, and the tragic story was told of a cow who got in there and sank till nothing was visible but a pair of horns above the mud, which suffocated the unwary beast. For this reason it was called Cowslip Marsh, the wag said, though it was generally believed to be so named for the yellow flowers which grew there in great profusion in the spring. Sam had seen Ben hop nimbly from one tuft of grass to another when he went to gather cowslips for Betty, and the stout boy thought he could do the same. 2 or 3 heavy jumps landed him, not among the bulrushes, as he had hoped, but in a pool of muddy water, where he sank up to his middle with alarming rapidity. Much scared, he tried to wade out, but could only flounder to a tussock of grass and cling there while he endeavored to kick his legs free. He got them out, but struggled in vain to coil them up or to hoist his heavy body upon the very small island in this sea of mud. Down they splashed again, and Sam gave a dismal groan as he thought of the leeches and water snakes which might be lying in wait below. Visions of the lost cow also flashed across his agitated mind, and he gave a despairing shout, very like a distracted moo. Few people passed along the lane, and the sun was setting, so the prospect of a night in the marsh nerved Sam to make a frantic plunge toward the bulrush island, which was nearer than the mainland, and looked firmer than any tussock round him. But he failed to reach this haven of rest and was forced to stop at an old stump which stuck up, looking very like the moss-grown horns of the deer departed. Roosting here, Sam began to shout for aid in every key possible to the human voice. Such hoots and howls, whistles and roars never woke the echoes of the lonely marsh before, or scared the portly frog who resided there in calm seclusion. He hardly expected any reply, but the astonished caw of the crow, who sat upon a fence watching him with gloomy interest. And when a cheerful "Hello there!" sounded from the lane, he was so grateful that tears of joy rolled down his fat cheeks. "Come on! I'm in the mash! Lend a hand and get me out!" bawled Sam, anxiously waiting for his deliverer to appear, for he could only see a hat bobbing along behind the hazel bushes that fringed the lane. Steps crashed through the bushes, and then over the wall came an active figure, at the sight of which Sam was almost ready to dive out of sight. For, of all possible boys, who should it be but Ben, the last person in the world whom he would like to have see him in his present pitiful plight. "Is it you, Sam? Well, you are in a nice fix." And Ben's eyes began to twinkle with mischievous merriment, as well they might, for Sam certainly was a spectacle to convulse the soberest person. Perched unsteadily on the gnarled stump, with his muddy legs drawn up, his dismal face splashed with mud, and the whole lower half of his body as black as if he had been dipped in an inkstand, he presented such a comically doleful object that Ben danced about, laughing like a naughty will-o'-the-wisp who, having led a traveller astray, then fell to jeering at him. "Stop that, or I'll knock your head off!" roared Sam in a rage. "Come on and do it, I give you leave," answered Ben, sparring away derisively as the other tottered on his perch and was forced to hold tight lest he should tumble off. "Don't laugh, there's a good chap, but fish me out somehow, or I shall get my death sitting here all wet and cold," whined Sam, changing his tone, and feeling bitterly that Ben had the upper hand now. Ben felt it also, and though a very good-natured boy, could not resist the temptation to enjoy this advantage for a moment at least. "I won't laugh if I can help it, only you do look so like a fat speckled frog. I may not be able to hold in. I'll pull you out pretty soon, but first I'm going to talk to you, Sam," said Ben, sobering down as he took a seat on the little point of land nearest the stranded Samuel. "Hurry up, then. I'm as stiff as a board now, and it's no fun sitting here on this naughty old thing," growled Sam, with a discontented squirm. "Dare say not, but it is good for you, as you say when you rap me over the head. Look here, I've got you in a tight place, and I don't mean to help you a bit till you promise to let me alone. Now then," and Ben's face grew stern with his remembered wrongs as he grimly eyed his discomfited foe. "I'll promise fast enough, if you won't tell anyone about this," answered Sam, surveying himself and his surroundings with great disgust. "I shall do as I like about that." "Then I won't promise a thing. I'm not going to have the whole school laughing at me," protested Sam, who hated to be ridiculed even more than Ben did. "Very well. Good night." And Ben walked off with his hands in his pockets, as coolly as if the bog was Sam's favorite retreat. "Hold on! Don't be in such a hurry!" shouted Sam, seeing little hope of rescue if he let this chance go. "All right." And back came Ben, ready for further negotiations. "I'll promise not to plague you if you'll promise not to tell on me. Is that what you want? Now I come to think of it, there is one thing more. I like to make a good bargain when I begin," said Ben, with a shrewd air. "You must promise to keep Mose quiet, too. He follows your lead, and if you tell him to stop it, he will. If I was big enough, I'd make you hold your tongues. I ain't, so we'll try this way." Yes, yes, I'll see to Mose. Now, bring on a rail, there's a good fellow. I've got a horrid cramp in my legs, began Sam, thinking he had bought help dearly, yet admiring Ben's cleverness in making the most of his chance. Ben brought the rail, but just as he was about to lay it from the mainland to the nearest tussock, he stopped, saying, with a naughty twinkle in his black eyes again, "One more little thing must be settled first, and then I'll get you ashore. Promise you won't plague the girls either, especially Bab and Betty. You pull their hair and they don't like it." "Don't neither. Wouldn't touch that Bab for $1. She scratches and bites like a mad cat," was Sam's sulky reply. "Glad of it. She can take care of herself. Betty can't. And if you touch one of her pigtails, I'll up and tell right out how I found you sniveling in the mash like a great baby. So now." And Ben emphasized his threat with a blow of the suspended rail, which splashed the water over poor Sam, quenching his last spark of resistance. "Stop! I will! I will!" "True as you live and breathe," demanded Ben, sternly binding him by the most solemn oath he knew. "True as I live and breathe," echoed Sam, dolefully relinquishing his favorite pastime of pulling Betty's braids and asking if she was at home. "I'll come over there and crook fingers on the bargain," said Ben, settling the rail and running over it to the tuft, then bridging another pool and crossing again till he came to the stump. "I never thought of that way," said Sam, watching him with much inward chagrin at his own failure. "I should think you'd written 'Look before you leap' in your copybook often enough to get the idea into your stupid head. Come, crook," commanded Ben, leaning forward with extended little finger. Sam obediently performed the ceremony, and then Ben sat astride one of the horns of the stump, while the muddy Crusoe went slowly across the rail from point to point till he landed safely on the shore, when he turned about and asked with an ungrateful jeer, "Now what's going to become of you, old look-before-you-leap?" "Mud turtles can only sit on a stump and bawl till they are taken off, but frogs have legs worth something and are not afraid of a little water," answered Ben, hopping away in an opposite direction, since the pools between him and Sam were too wide for even his lively legs. Sam waddled off to the brook in the lane to rinse the mud from his nether man before facing his mother, and was just wringing himself out when Ben came up, breathless but good-natured, for he felt that he had made an excellent bargain for himself and friends. "Better wash your face. It's as speckled as a tiger lily. Here's my handkerchief if yours is wet," he said, pulling out a dingy article which had evidently already done service as a towel. "Don't want it," muttered Sam gruffly, as he poured the water out of his muddy shoes. "I was taught to say thankee when folks got me out of scrapes. But you never had much bringing up, though you do live in a house with a gambrel roof," retorted Ben, sarcastically quoting Sam's frequent boast. Then he walked off, much disgusted with the ingratitude of man. Sam forgot his manners, but he remembered his promise and kept it so well that all the school wondered. No one could guess the secret of Ben's power over him, though it was evident that he had gained it in some sudden way, for at the least sign of Sam's former tricks, Ben would crook his little finger and wag it warningly, or call out, "Bulrushes," and Sam subsided with reluctant submission, to the great amazement of his mates. When asked what it meant, Sam turned sulky, but Ben had much fun out of it, assuring the other boys that those were the signs and password of a secret society to which he and Sam belonged, and promised to tell them all about it if Sam would give him leave, which, of course, he would not. This mystery, and the vain endeavors to find it out, caused a lull in the war of the woodpile, and before any new game was invented, something happened which gave the children plenty to talk about for a time. A week after the secret alliance was formed, Ben ran in one evening with a letter for Miss Celia. He found her enjoying the cheery blaze of the pine cones the little girls had picked up for her, and Bab and Betty sat in the small chairs rocking luxuriously as they took turns to throw on the pretty fuel. Miss Celia turned quickly to receive the expected letter, glanced at the writing, postmark, and stamp, with an air of delighted surprise, then clasped it close in both hands, saying, as she hurried out of the room, "He is come! He is come! Now you may tell them, Thorny." "Tell us what?" asked Bab, pricking up her ears at once. "Oh, it's only that George has come, and I suppose we shall go and get married right away," answered Thorny, rubbing his hands as if he enjoyed the prospect. "Are you going to be married?" asked Betty, so soberly that the boys shouted, and Thorny, with difficulty, composed himself sufficiently to explain. "No, child, not just yet, but sister is, and I must go and see that all is done up ship-shape, and bring you home some wedding cake. Ben will take care of you while I'm gone." "When shall you go?" asked Bab, beginning to long for her share of cake. "Tomorrow, I guess. Celia has been packed and ready for a week. We agreed to meet George in New York, and be married as soon as he got his best clothes unpacked. We are men of our word, and off we go. Won't it be fun?" "But when will you come back again?" questioned Betty, looking anxious. "Don't know. Sister wants to come soon, but I'd rather have our honeymoon somewhere else. Niagara, Newfoundland, West Point, or the Rocky Mountains," said Thorny, mentioning a few of the places he most desired to see. "Do you like him?" asked Ben, very naturally wondering if the new master would approve of the young man-of-all-work. "Don't I? George is regularly jolly, though now he's a minister, perhaps he'll stiffen up and turn sober. Won't it be a shame if he does?" And Thorny looked alarmed at the thought of losing his congenial friend. "Tell about him. Miss Celia said you might," put in Bab, whose experience of jolly ministers had been small. "Oh, there isn't much about it. We met in Switzerland, going up Mount St. Bernard in a storm, and—" "Where the good dogs live?" inquired Betty, hoping they would come into the story. "Yes, we spent the night up there, and George gave us his room. The house was so full, and he wouldn't let me go down a steep place where I wanted to, and Celia thought he'd saved my life, and was very good to him. Then we kept meeting, and the first thing I knew, she went and was engaged to him. I didn't care, only she would come home, so he might go on studying hard and get through quick. That was a year ago, and last winter we were in New York at Uncle's, and then, in the spring, I was sick, and we came here, and that's all." "Shall you live here always when you come back?" asked Bab, as Thorny paused for breath. "Celia wants to. I shall go to college, so I don't mind. George is going to help the old minister here and see how he likes it. I'm to study with him, and if he is as pleasant as he used to be, we shall have capital times, see if we don't." "I wonder if he will want me round," said Ben, feeling no desire to be a tramp again. "I do, so you needn't fret about that, my hearty," answered Thorny, with a resounding slap on the shoulder which reassured Ben more than any promises. "I'd like to see a live wedding. Then we could play it with our dolls. I've got a nice piece of mosquito netting for a veil, and Belinda's white dress is clean. Do you suppose Miss Celia will ask us to hers?" said Betty to Bab, as the boys began to discuss St. Bernard dogs with spirit. "I wish I could, dears," answered a voice behind them, and there was Miss Celia, looking so happy that the little girls wondered what the letter could have said to give her such bright eyes and smiling lips. "I shall not be gone long, or be a bit changed when I come back, to live among you years, I hope, for I'm fond of the old place now, and mean it shall be home," she added, caressing the yellow heads as if they were dear to her. "Oh, goody!" cried Bab, while Betty whispered, with both arms round Miss Celia, "I don't think we could bear to have anybody else come here to live." "It is very pleasant to hear you say that, and I mean to make others feel so, if I can. I've been trying a little this summer, but when I come back I shall go to work in earnest to be a good minister's wife, and you must help me." "We will," promised both children, ready for anything except preaching in the high pulpit. Then Miss Celia turned to Ben, saying, in the respectful way that always made him feel at least 25, "We shall be off tomorrow, and I leave you in charge. Go on just as if we were here, and be sure nothing will be changed as far as you are concerned when we come back." Ben's face beamed at that, but the only way he could express his relief was by making such a blaze in honor of the occasion that he nearly roasted the company. Next morning the brother and sister slipped quietly away, and the children hurried to school, eager to tell the great news that Miss Celia and Thorny had gone to be married and were coming back to live here for ever and ever. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Under the Lilacs by Louisa May Alcott. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Somebody Comes. Bab and Betty had been playing in the avenue all the afternoon several weeks later, but as the shadows began to lengthen, both agreed to sit upon the gate and rest while waiting for Ben, who had gone nutting with a party of boys. When they played house, Bab was always the father, and went hunting or fishing with great energy and success, bringing home all sorts of game, from elephants and crocodiles to hummingbirds and minnows. Betty was the mother, and a most notable little housewife, always mixing up imaginary delicacies with sand and dirt in old pans and broken china, which she baked in an oven of her own construction. Both had worked hard that day, and were glad to retire to their favorite lounging place, where Bab was happy trying to walk across the wide top bar without falling off, and Betty enjoyed slow, luxurious swings while her sister was recovering from her tumbles. On this occasion, having indulged their respective tastes, they paused for a brief interval of conversation, sitting side by side on the gate like a pair of plump gray chickens gone to roost. "Don't you hope Ben will get his bag full? We shall have such fun eating nuts evenings," observed Bab, wrapping her arms in her apron, for it was October now, and the air was growing keen. "Yes, and Ma says we may boil some in our little kettles. Ben promised we should have half," answered Betty, still intent on her cookery. "I shall save some of mine for Thorny. I shall keep lots of mine for Miss Celia. Doesn't it seem more than 2 weeks since she went away? I wonder what she'll bring us." Before Bab could conjecture, the sound of a step and a familiar whistle made both look expectantly toward the turn in the road, all ready to cry out in one voice, "How many have you got?" Neither spoke a word, however, for the figure which presently appeared was not Ben, but a stranger, a man who stopped whistling and came slowly on, dusting his shoes in the wayside grass, and brushing the sleeves of his shabby velveteen coat, as if anxious to freshen himself up a bit. "It's a tramp! Let's run away," whispered Betty after a hasty look. "I ain't afraid," and Bab was about to assume her boldest look when a sneeze spoilt it and made her clutch the gate to hold on. At that unexpected sound the man looked up, showing a thin, dark face with a pair of sharp black eyes, which surveyed the little girls so steadily that Betty quaked, and Bab began to wish she had at least jumped down inside the gate. "How are you?" said the man, with a good-natured nod and smile, as if to reassure the round-eyed children staring at him. "Pretty well, thank you, sir," responded Bab, politely nodding back to him. "Folks at home?" asked the man, looking over their heads toward the house. "Only Ma. All the rest have gone to be married." "That sounds lively. At the other place all the folks had gone to a funeral," and the man laughed as he glanced at the big house on the hill. "Why, do you know the squire?" exclaimed Bab, much surprised and reassured. "Come on purpose to see him. Just strolling round till he gets back," with an impatient sort of sigh. "Betty thought you was a tramp, but I wasn't afraid. I like tramps ever since Ben came," explained Bab with her usual candor. "Who's Ben?" And the man came nearer so quickly that Betty nearly fell backward. Don't you be scared, sissy. I like little girls, so you set easy and tell me about Ben," he added in a persuasive tone, as he leaned on the gate so near that both could see what a friendly face he had in spite of its eager, anxious look. "Ben is Miss Celia's boy. We found him most starved in the coach-house, and he's been here ever since," answered Bab comprehensively. "Tell me about it. I like tramps, too." And the man looked as if he did very much, as Bab told the little story in a few childish words that were better than a much more elegant account. "You were very good to the little feller," was all the man said when she ended her somewhat confused tale, in which she had jumbled the old coach and Miss Celia, dinner pails and nutting, Sancho and circuses. "Course we were. He's a nice boy, and we are fond of him, and he likes us," said Bab heartily. "'Specially me," put in Betty, quite at ease now, for the black eyes had softened wonderfully, and the brown face was smiling all over. "Don't wonder a mite. You are the nicest pair of little girls I've seen this long time." And the man put a hand on either side of them, as if he wanted to hug the chubby children. But he didn't do it. He merely smiled and stood there asking questions till the two chatterboxes had told him everything there was to tell in the most confiding manner, for he very soon ceased to seem like a stranger, and looked so familiar that Bab, growing inquisitive in her turn, suddenly said, "Haven't you ever been here before? It seems as if I'd seen you." "Never in my life. Guess you've seen somebody that looks like me." And the black eyes twinkled for a minute as they looked into the puzzled little faces before him. Then he said, soberly, "I'm looking round for a likely boy. Don't you think this Ben would suit me? I want just such a lively sort of chap." "Are you a circus man?" asked Bab quickly. "Well, no, not now. I'm in better business." "I'm glad of it. We don't approve of 'em, but I do think they're splendid." Bab began by gravely quoting Miss Celia, and ended with an irrepressible burst of admiration which contrasted drolly with her first remark. Betty added anxiously, "We can't let Ben go anyway. I know he wouldn't want to, and Miss Celia would feel bad. Please don't ask him." "He can do as he likes, I suppose. He hasn't got any folks of his own, has he?" "No, his father died in California, and Ben felt so bad he cried, and we were real sorry, and gave him a piece of Ma, 'cause he was so lonesome," answered Betty in her tender little voice, with a pleading look which made the man stroke her smooth cheek and say, quite softly, "Bless your heart for that. I won't take him away, child, or do a thing to trouble anybody that's been good to him." "He's coming now. I hear Sanch barking at the squirrels," cried Bab, standing up to get a good look down the road. The man turned quickly, and Betty saw that he breathed fast as he watched the spot where the low sunshine lay warmly on the red maple at the corner. Into this glow came unconscious Ben, whistling Rory O'Moore, loud and clear, as he trudged along with a heavy bag of nuts over his shoulder and the light full on his contented face. Sancho trotted before and saw the stranger first, for the sun in Ben's eyes dazzled him. Since his sad loss, Sancho cherished a strong dislike to tramps, and now he paused to growl and show his teeth, evidently intending to warn this one off the premises. "He won't hurt you," began Bab encouragingly, but before she could add a chiding word to the dog, Sanch gave an excited howl and flew at the man's throat as if about to throttle him. Betty screamed, and Bab was about to go to the rescue, when both perceived that the dog was licking the stranger's face in an ecstasy of joy, and heard the man say as he hugged the curly beast, "Good old Sanch! I knew he wouldn't forget master, and he doesn't." "What's the matter?" called Ben, coming up briskly, with a strong grip on his stout stick. There was no need of any answer, for as he came into the shadow, he saw the man, and stood looking at him as if he were a ghost. "It's father, Benny. Don't you know me?" asked the man, with an odd sort of choke in his voice, as he thrust the dog away and held out both hands to the boy. Down dropped the nuts, and crying, "Oh, Daddy, Daddy!" Ben cast himself into the arms of the shabby velveteen coat, while poor Sanch tore round them in distracted circles, barking wildly, as if that was the only way in which he could vent his rapture. What happened next, Bab and Betty never stopped to see, but, dropping from their roost, they went flying home like startled chicken littles, with the astounding news that Ben's father has come alive, and Sancho knew him right away. Mrs. Moss had just got her cleaning done up, and was resting a minute before setting the table, but she flew out of her old rocking chair when the excited children told the wonderful tale, exclaiming as they ended, "Where is he? Go bring him here. I declare it fairly takes my breath away." Before Bab could obey, or her mother compose herself, Sancho bounced in and spun round like an insane top, trying to stand on his head, walk upright, waltz and bark all at once, for the good old fellow had so lost his head that he forgot the loss of his tail. "They are coming! They are coming! See, Ma, what a nice man he is," said Bab, hopping about on one foot as she watched the slowly approaching pair. "My patience, don't they look alike? I should know he was Ben's pa anywhere," said Mrs. Moss, running to the door in a hurry. They certainly did resemble one another, and it was almost comical to see the same curve in the legs, the same wide-awake style of wearing the hat, the same sparkle of the eye, good-natured smile and agile motion of every limb. Old Ben carried the bag in one hand, while young Ben held the other fast, looking a little shamefaced at his own emotion now, for there were marks of tears on his cheeks, but too glad to repress the delight he felt that he had really found Daddy this side heaven. Mrs. Moss unconsciously made a pretty little picture of herself as she stood at the door with her honest face shining and both hands out, saying in a hearty tone, which was a welcome in itself, "I'm real glad to see you safe and well, Mr. Brown. Come right in and make yourself to home. I guess there isn't a happier boy living than Ben is tonight. And I know there isn't a gratefuller man living than I am for your kindness to my poor forsaken little feller," answered Mr. Brown, dropping both his burdens to give the comely woman's hands a hard shake. "Now, don't say a word about it, but sit down and rest, and we'll have tea in less than no time. Ben must be tired and hungry, though he's so happy. I don't believe he knows it," laughed Mrs. Moss, bustling away to hide the tears in her eyes, anxious to make things sociable and easy all round. With this end in view, she set forth her best china and covered the table with food enough for a dozen, thanking her stars that it was baking day and everything had turned out well. Ben and his father sat talking by the window till they were bidden to draw up and help themselves, with such hospitable warmth that everything had an extra relish to the hungry pair. Ben paused occasionally to stroke the rusty coat sleeve with bread and buttery fingers to convince himself that Daddy had really come, and his father disposed of various inconvenient emotions by eating as if food was unknown in California. Mrs. Moss beamed on everyone from behind the big teapot like a mild full moon, while Bab and Betty kept interrupting one another in their eagerness to tell something new about Ben and how Sanch lost his tail. "Now, you let Mr. Brown talk a little. We all want to hear how he came alive, as you call it," said Mrs. Moss, as they drew round the fire in the settin' room, leaving the tea things to take care of themselves. It was not a long story, but a very interesting one to this circle of listeners, all about the wild life on the plains trading for mustangs, the terrible kick from a vicious horse that nearly killed Ben, Sr., the long months of unconsciousness in the California hospital, the slow recovery, the journey back, Mr. Smithers' tale of the boy's disappearance, and then the anxious trip to find out from Squire Allen where he now was. "I asked the hospital folks to write and tell you as soon as I knew whether I was on my head or my heels, and they promised, but they didn't. So I came off the minute I could and worked my way back, expecting to find you at the old place. I was afraid you'd have worn out your welcome here and gone off again, for you are as fond of travelling as your father." "I wanted to, sometimes, but the folks here were so dreadful good to me, I couldn't," confessed Ben, secretly surprised to find that the prospect of going off with Daddy even cost him a pang of regret, for the boy had taken root in the friendly soil and was no longer a wandering thistledown, tossed about by every wind that blew. "I know what I owe 'em, and you and I will work out that debt before we die, or our name isn't B.B.," said Mr. Brown, with an emphatic slap on his knee, which Ben imitated half unconsciously as he exclaimed heartily, "That's so," adding, more quietly, "What are you going to do now? Go back to Smithers and the old business?" "Not likely after the way he treated you, sonny. I've had it out with him, and he won't want to see me again in a hurry," answered Mr. Brown, with a sudden kindling of the eye that reminded Bab of Ben's face when he shook her after losing Sancho. "There's more circuses than his in the world, but I'll have to limber out ever so much before I'm good for much in that line," said the boy, stretching his stout arms and legs with a curious mixture of satisfaction and regret. "You've been living in clover and got fat, you rascal," and his father gave him a poke here and there, as Mr. Squeers did the plump Wackford when displaying him as a specimen of the fine diet at Do the Boys Hall. "Don't believe I could put you up now if I tried, for I haven't got my strength back yet, and we are both out of practice. It's just as well, for I've about made up my mind to quit the business and settle down somewhere for a spell, if I can get anything to do," continued the rider, folding his arms and gazing thoughtfully into the fire. "I shouldn't wonder a mite if you could right here, for Mr. Town has a great boarding stable over yonder, and he's always wanting men," said Mrs. Moss eagerly, for she dreaded to have Ben go, and no one could forbid it if his father chose to take him away. "That sounds likely, thanky, mem. I'll look up the concern and try my chance. Would you call it too great a come down to have a father an ostler after being first rider in the great golden menagerie, circus, and coliseum, eh, Ben?" asked Mr. Brown, quoting the well-remembered show bill with a laugh. "No, I shouldn't. It's real jolly up there when the big barn is full and 80 horses have to be taken care of. I love to go and see 'em. Mr. Town asked me to come and be stable boy when I rode the kicking gray the rest were afraid of. I hankered to go, but Miss Celia had just got my new books, and I knew she'd feel bad if I gave up going to school. Now I'm glad I didn't, for I get on first rate and like it." "You done right, boy, and I'm pleased with you. Don't you ever be ungrateful to them that befriended you, if you want to prosper. I'll tackle the stable business on Monday and see what's to be done. Now, I ought to be walking, but I'll be round in the morning, ma'am, if you can spare Ben for a spell tomorrow. We'd like to have a good Sunday tramp and talk, wouldn't we, sonny?" And Mr. Brown rose to go, with his hand on Ben's shoulder, as if loath to leave him even for the night. Mrs. Moss saw the longing in his face, and forgetting that he was an utter stranger, spoke right out of her hospitable heart. "It's a long piece to the tavern, and my little back bedroom is always ready. It won't make a mite of trouble if you don't mind a plain place, and you are heartily welcome." Mr. Brown looked pleased, but hesitated to accept any further favor from the good soul who had already done so much for him and his. Ben gave him no time to speak, however, for running to a door he flung it open and beckoned, saying eagerly, "Do stay, father. It will be so nice to have you. This is a tip-top room. I slept here the night I came, and that bed was just splendid after bare ground for a fortnight." "I'll stop, and as I'm pretty well done up, I guess we may as well turn in now," answered the new guest. Then, as if the memory of that homeless little lad so kindly cherished made his heart overflow in spite of him, Mr. Brown paused at the door to say hastily, with a hand on Bab and Betty's heads, as if his promise was a very earnest one, "I don't forget, ma'am. These children shall never want a friend while Ben Brown's alive." Then he shut the door so quickly that the other Ben's prompt, "Hear, hear," was cut short in the middle. "I suppose he means that we shall have a piece of Ben's father because we gave Ben a piece of our mother," said Betty softly. "Of course he does, and it's all fair," answered Bab decidedly. "Isn't he a nice man, Ma?" "Go to bed, children," was all the answer she got. But when they were gone, Mrs. Moss, as she washed up her dishes, more than once glanced at a certain nail where a man's hat had not hung for 5 years, and thought with a sigh what a natural, protecting air that slouched felt had. If one wedding were not quite enough for a children's story, we might here hint that no one dreamed of then that before the year came round again, Ben had found a mother, Bab and Betty a father, and Mr. Brown's hat was quite at home behind the kitchen door. But, on the whole, it is best not to say a word about it. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Under the Lilacs by Louisa May Alcott. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The great gate is opened. The Browns were up and out so early next morning that Bab and Betty were sure they had run away in the night. But on looking for them, they were discovered in the coach-house, criticizing Lita, both with their hands in their pockets, both chewing straws, and looking as much alike as a big elephant and a small one. "That's as pretty a little span as I've seen for a long time," said the elder Ben, as the children came trotting down the path hand in hand, with the 4 blue bows at the ends of their braids bobbing briskly up and down. "The nigh one is my favorite, but the off one is the best goer, though she's dreadfully hard-bitted," answered Ben, the younger, with such a comical assumption of a jockey's important air that his father laughed as he said in an undertone, "Come, boy, we must drop the old slang, since we've given up the old business. These good folks are making a gentleman of you, and I won't be the one to spoil their work. Hold on, my dears, and I'll show you how they say good morning in California," he added, beckoning to the little girls, who now came up rosy and smiling. "Breakfast is ready, sir," said Betty, looking much relieved to find them. "We thought you'd run away from us," explained Bab, as both put out their hands to shake those extended to them. "That would be a mean trick, but I'm going to run away with you," and Mr. Brown whisked up a little girl to either shoulder before they knew what had happened, while Ben, remembering the day, with difficulty restrained himself from turning a series of triumphant somersaults before them all the way to the door, where Mrs. Moss stood waiting for them. After breakfast, Ben disappeared for a short time and returned in his Sunday suit, looking so neat and fresh that his father surveyed him with surprise and pride as he came in full of boyish satisfaction in his trim array. "Here's a smart young chap. Did you take all that trouble just to go to walk with old Daddy?" asked Mr. Brown, stroking the smooth head, for they were alone just then, Mrs. Moss and the children being upstairs preparing for church. "I thought maybe you'd like to go to a meeting first," answered Ben, looking up at him with such a happy face that it was hard to refuse anything. "I'm too shabby, sonny, else I'd go in a minute to please you. Miss Celia said God didn't mind poor clothes, and she took me when I looked worse than you do. I always go in the morning. She likes to have me," said Ben, turning his hat about as if not quite sure what he ought to do. "Do you want to go?" asked his father in a tone of surprise. "I want to please her, if you don't mind. We could have our tramp this afternoon. I haven't been to meeting since Mother died, and it don't seem to come easy, though I know I ought to, seeing I'm alive and here." And Mr. Brown looked soberly out at the lovely autumn world, as if glad to be in it after his late danger and pain. "Miss Celia said church was a good place to take our troubles, and to be thankful in, I went when I thought you were dead, and now I'd love to go when I've got my daddy safe again." No one saw him, so Ben could not resist giving his father a sudden hug, which was warmly returned as the man said earnestly, "I'll go, and thank the Lord hearty for giving me back my boy, better'n I left him." For a minute nothing was heard but the loud tick of the old clock and a mournful whine from Sancho, shut up in the shed lest he should go to church without an invitation. Then, as steps were heard on the stairs, Mr. Brown caught up his hat, saying hastily, "I ain't fit to go with them, you tell 'em, and I'll slip into a back seat after folks are in. I know the way." And before Ben could reply, he was gone. Nothing was seen of him along the way, but he saw the little party and rejoiced again over his boy, changed in so many ways for the better. For Ben was the one thing which had kept his heart soft through all the trials and temptations of a rough life. I promised Mary I'd do my best for the poor baby she had to leave, and I tried, but I guess a better friend than I am has been raised up for him when he needed her most. It won't hurt me to follow him in this road," thought Mr. Brown, as he came out into the highway from his stroll across lots, feeling that it would be good for him to stay in this quiet place for his own as well as his son's sake. The bell had done ringing when he reached the green, but a single boy sat on the steps and ran to meet him, saying, with a reproachful look, "I wasn't going to let you be alone and have folks think I was ashamed of my father. Come, Daddy, we'll sit together." So Ben led his father straight to the squire's pew, and sat beside him with a face so full of innocent pride and joy that people would have suspected the truth if he had not already told many of them. Mr. Brown, painfully conscious of his shabby coat, was rather taken aback, as he expressed it, but the squire's shake of the hand and Mrs. Allen's gracious nod enabled him to face the eyes of the interested congregation, the younger portion of which stared steadily at him all sermon time, in spite of paternal frowns and maternal tweakings in the rear. But the crowning glory of the day came after church, when the squire said to Ben, and Sam heard him, "I've got a letter for you from Miss Celia. Come home with me and bring your father. I want to talk to him." The boy proudly escorted his parent to the old carryall, and, tucking himself in behind with Mrs. Allen, had the satisfaction of seeing the slouched felt hat side by side with the squire's Sunday beaver in front, as they drove off at such an unusually smart pace, it was evident that Duke knew there was a critical eye upon him. The interest taken in the father was owing to the son at first, but by the time the story was told, old Ben had won friends for himself, not only because of the misfortunes which he had evidently borne in a manly way, but because of his delight in the boy's improvement, and the desire he felt to turn his hand to any honest work, that he might keep Ben happy and contented in this good home. "I'll give you a line to town. Smithers spoke well of you, and your own ability will be the best recommendation," said the squire, as he parted from them at his door, having given Ben the letter. Miss Celia had been gone a fortnight, and everyone was longing to have her back. The first week brought Ben a newspaper, with a crinkly line drawn round the marriages to attract attention to that spot, and one was marked by a black frame, with a large hand pointing at it from the margin. Thorny sent that. But the next week came a parcel for Mrs. Moss, and in it was discovered a box of wedding cake for every member of the family, including Sancho, who ate his at one gulp and chewed up the lace paper which covered it. This was the third week, and as if there could not be happiness enough crowded into it for Ben, the letter he read on his way home told him that his dear mistress was coming back on the following Saturday. One passage particularly pleased him. "I want the great gate opened, so that the new master may go in that way. Will you see that it is done? And all made neat afterward. Randa will give you the key, and you may have out all your flags if you like, for the old place cannot look too gay for this homecoming." Sunday though it was, Ben could not help waving the letter over his head as he ran in to tell Mrs. Moss the glad news, and begin at once to plan the welcome they would give Miss Celia, for he never called her anything else. During their afternoon stroll in the mellow sunshine, Ben continued to talk of her, never tired of telling about his happy summer under her roof. And Mr. Brown was never weary of hearing, for every hour showed him more plainly what a lovely miracle her gentle words had wrought, and every hour increased his gratitude, his desire to return the kindness in some humble way. He had his wish, and did his part handsomely when he least expected to have a chance. On Monday he saw Mr. Town, and thanks to the squire's good word, was engaged for a month on trial, making himself so useful that it was soon evident that he was the right man in the right place. He lived on the hill, but managed to get down to the little brown house in the evening for a word with Ben, who just now was as full of business as if the president and his cabinet were coming. Everything was put in apple pie order in and about the old house. The great gate, with much creaking of rusty hinges and some clearing away of rubbish, was set wide open, and the first creature who entered it was Sancho, solemnly dragging the dead mullein which long ago had grown above the keyhole. October frosts seemed to have spared some of the brightest leaves for this especial occasion, and on Saturday the arched gateway was hung with gay wreaths, red and yellow sprays strewed the flags, and the porch was a blaze of colour with the red woodbine that was in its glory when the honeysuckle was leafless. Fortunately, it was a half-holiday, so the children could trim and chatter to their heart's content, and the little girls ran about sticking funny decorations where no one would ever think of looking for them. Ben was absorbed in his flags, which were sprinkled all down the avenue with a lavish display, suggesting several 4th of Julys rolled into one. Mr. Brown had come to lend a hand, and did so most energetically, for the breakneck things he did with his son during the decoration fever would have terrified Mrs. Moss out of her wits if she had not been in the house giving last touches to every room, while Randa and Katy set forth a sumptuous tea. All was going well, and the train would be due in an hour, when luckless Bab nearly turned the rejoicing into mourning, the feast into ashes. She heard her mother say to Randa, "There ought to be a fire in every room, it looks so cheerful, and the air is chilly, spite of the sunshine." And, never waiting to hear the reply that some of the long unused chimneys were not safe till cleaned, off went Bab with an apronful of old shingles, and made a roaring blaze in the front room fireplace, which was of all others the one to be let alone, as the flue was out of order. Charmed with the brilliant light and the crackle of the tindery fuel, Miss Bab refilled her apron and fed the fire till the chimney began to rumble ominously, sparks to fly out at the top, and soot and swallows' nests to come tumbling down upon the hearth. Then, scared at what she had done, the little mischief-maker hastily buried her fire, swept up the rubbish, and ran off, thinking no one would discover her prank if she never told. Everybody was very busy, and the big chimney blazed and rumbled unnoticed, till the cloud of smoke caught Ben's eyes as he festooned his last effort in the flag line, part of an old sheet with the words, "Father has come," in red cambric letters, half a foot long, sewed upon it. "Hullo! I do believe they've got up a bonfire without asking my leave. Miss Celia never would let us, because the sheds and roofs are so old and dry. I must see about it. Catch me, Daddy, I'm coming down," cried Ben, dropping out of the elm with no more thought of where he might light than a squirrel swinging from bough to bough. His father caught him and followed in haste as his nimble-footed son raced up the avenue to stop in the gateway, frightened at the prospect before him, for falling sparks had already kindled the roof here and there, and the chimney smoked and roared like a small volcano, while Katy's wails and Randa's cries for water came from within. "Up there with wet blankets, while I get out the hose," cried Mr. Brown, as he saw at a glance what the danger was. Ben vanished, and before his father got the garden hose rigged, He was on the roof with a dripping blanket over the worst spot. Mrs. Moss had her wits about her in a minute, and ran to put in the fireboard and stop the draught. Then, stationing Randa to watch that the falling cinders did no harm inside, she hurried off to help Mr. Brown, who might not know where things were. But he had roughed it so long that he was the man for emergencies, and seemed to lay his hand on whatever was needed by a sort of instinct. Finding that the hose was too short to reach the upper part of the roof, he was on the roof in a jiffy with 2 pails of water, and quenched the most dangerous spot before much harm was done. This he kept up till the chimney burned itself out, while Ben dodged about among the gables with a watering pot, lest some stray sparks should be overlooked and break out afresh. While they worked there, Betty ran to and fro with a dipper of water trying to help, and Sancho barked violently as if he objected to this sort of illumination. But where was Bab, who revelled in flurries? No one missed her till the fire was out, and the tired, sooty people met to talk over the danger just escaped. Poor Miss Celia wouldn't have had a roof over her head if it hadn't been for you, Mr. Brown, said Mrs. Moss, sinking into a kitchen chair, pale with excitement. It would have burnt lively, but I guess it's all right now. Keep an eye on the roof, Ben, and I'll step up garret and see if all's safe there. Didn't you know that chimney was foul, ma'am? Asked the man, as he wiped the perspiration off his grimy face. Randa said it was, and I'm surprised she made a fire there, began Mrs. Moss, looking at the maid, who just then came in with a pan full of soot. Bless you, ma'am, I never thought of such a thing, nor Katy neither. That naughty Bab must have done it, and so don't darse to show herself, answered the irate Randa, whose nice room was in a mess. Where is the child? Asked her mother, and a hunt was immediately instituted by Betty and Sancho, while the elders cleared up. Anxious Betty searched high and low, called and cried, but all in vain, and was about to sit down in despair, when Sancho made a bolt into his new kennel and brought out a shoe with a foot in it, while a doleful squeal came from the straw within. "Oh, Bab, how could you do it? Ma was frightened dreadfully," said Betty, gently tugging at the striped leg, as Sancho poked his head in for another shoe. "Is it all burnt up?" demanded a smothered voice from the recesses of the kennel. "Only pieces of the roof. Ben and his father put it out, and I helped," answered Betty, cheering up a little as she recalled her noble exertions. "What do they do to folks who set houses afire?" asked the voice again. "I don't know, but you needn't be afraid. There isn't much harm done, I guess, and Miss Celia will forgive you. She's so good." "Thorny won't. He calls me a botheration, and I guess I am," mourned the unseen culprit with sincere contrition. "I'll ask him. He is always good to me." "They will be here pretty soon, so you better come out and be made tidy," suggested the comforter. "I never can come out, for everyone will hate me," sobbed Bab among the straw, as she pulled in her foot as if retiring forever from an outraged world. "Ma won't. She's too busy cleaning up, so it's a good time to come. Let's run home, wash our hands, and be all nice when they see us. I'll love you no matter what anybody else does," said Betty, consoling the poor little sinner, and proposing the sort of repentance most likely to find favor in the eyes of the agitated elders. "P'raps I better go home, for Sancho'll want his bed." And Bab gladly availed herself of that excuse to back out of her refuge, a very crumpled, dusty young lady, with a dejected face and much straw sticking in her hair. Betty led her sadly away, for she still protested that she should never dare to meet the offended public again, but in 15 minutes both appeared in fine order and good spirits, and naughty Bab escaped a lecture for the time being, as the train would soon be due. At the first sound of the car whistle, everyone turned good-natured, as if by magic, and flew to the gate smiling as if all mishaps were forgiven and forgotten. Mrs. Moss, however, slipped quietly away, and was the first to greet Mrs. Celia as the carriage stopped at the entrance of the avenue, so that the luggage might go in by way of the lodge. "We will walk up and you shall tell us the news as we go, for I see you have some," said the young lady in her friendly manner, when Mrs. Moss had given her welcome and paid her respects to the gentleman, who shook hands in a way that convinced her he was indeed what Thorny called him, regularly jolly, though he was a minister. That being exactly what she came for, the good woman told her tidings as rapidly as possible, and the newcomers were so glad to hear of Ben's happiness that they made very light of Bab's bonfire, though it had nearly burnt their house down. "We won't say a word about it, for everyone must be happy today," said Mr. George, so kindly that Mrs. Moss felt a load taken off her heart at once. "Bab was always teasing me for fireworks, but I guess she has had enough for the present," laughed Thorny, who was gallantly escorting Bab's mother up the avenue. "Everyone is so kind. Teacher was out with the children to cheer us as we passed, and here you all are making things pretty for me," said Mrs. Celia, smiling with tears in her eyes as they drew near the great gate, which certainly did present an animated, if not an imposing appearance. Randa and Katy stood on one side, all in their best, bobbing delighted curtsies. Mr. Brown, half hidden behind the gate on the other side, was keeping Sancho erect, so that he might present arms promptly when the bride appeared. As flowers were scarce, on either post stood a rosy little girl clapping her hands, while out from the thicket of red and yellow boughs, which made a grand bouquet in the lantern frame, came Ben's head and shoulders as he waved his grandest flag with its gold paper, "Welcome Home," on a blue ground. "Isn't it beautiful?" cried Mrs. Celia, throwing kisses to the children, shaking hands with her maids, and glancing brightly at the stranger who was keeping Sanch quiet. "Most people adorn their gate posts with stone balls, vases, or griffins. Your living images are a great improvement, love, especially the happy boy in the middle," said Mr. George, eyeing Ben with interest as he nearly tumbled overboard, top-heavy with his banner. "You must finish what I have only begun," answered Celia, adding gaily as Sancho broke loose and came to offer both his paw and his congratulations. "Sanch, introduce your master, that I may thank him for coming back in time to save my old house. If I'd saved a dozen, it wouldn't have half paid for all you've done for my boy, ma'am," answered Mr. Brown, bursting out from behind the gate quite red with gratitude and pleasure. "I loved to do it. So please remember that this is still his home till you make one for him. Thank God he is no longer fatherless." And her sweet face said even more than her words as the white hand cordially shook the brown one with a burn across the back. "Come on, sister, I see the tea table all ready and I'm awfully hungry," interrupted Thorny, who had not a ray of sentiment about him, though very glad Ben had got his father back again. "Come over by and by, little friends, and let me thank you for your pretty welcome. It certainly is a warm one." And Mrs. Celia glanced merrily from the three bright faces above her to the old chimney, which still smoked sullenly. "Oh, don't!" cried Bab, hiding her face. "She didn't mean to," added Betty pleadingly. "Three cheers for the bride!" roared Ben, dipping his flag, as leaning on her husband's arm, his dear mistress passed under the gay arch, along the leaf-strewn walk, over the threshold of the house which was to be her happy home for many years. The closed gate, where the lonely little wanderer once lay, was always to stand open now, and the path where children played before was free to all comers, for a hospitable welcome henceforth awaited rich and poor, young and old, sad and gay, under the lilacs. End of Under the Lilacs by Louisa May Alcott. Read by Tara Dow.